I would like to welcome you to the 35th Annual Montana Economic Outlook Seminar. This seminar is sponsored by and produced by the Bureau of Business and, the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. My name is Paul Polzin, and I will be your moderator today. Now I would like to introduce Trish Hightower from First Interstate Bank, who will give us a formal introduction. Trish.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning on our 35th, I couldn't believe that, 35th Montana Economic Outlook Seminar. First Interstate's proud to continue to support this important event, and I'm even prouder to be a part of a financial institution that prides itself on supporting the communities we serve. If you haven't had the opportunity to walk through our new downtown facility, I please invite you to. And we believe in supporting the communities we invest, and that's a direct evidence of that. Without further ado, you haven't heard enough about banking, I'm sure, lately. Let's get back to the program.
Thank you very much, Trish. By way of further introduction, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. We were founded in 1948. We are the research arm of the School of Business Administration at the University of Montana. We do a wide variety of economic analysis, forecasting, survey research, and we monitor all of the major industries in Montana and in the Missoula economy. We publish the Montana Business Quarterly, which many of you subscribe to. And there's additional information about the Bureau on the inside front cover of your briefing book. As you can see, we have a number of sponsors for this seminar, and I would like to thank them and recognize them. The sponsors are Northwestern Energy, Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Montana State Fund, and here in Missoula, First Interstate Bank. These sponsors are one of the reasons why we can bring this seminar to you, and we greatly appreciate their help. Now bear with me for a minute, but a number of organizations have or grant continuing education credit for those attending our seminar. And I'd briefly like to go through those organizations which are giving continuing education credit. They are the Montana Board of Realty Regulation, the Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, the Montana Insurance Continuing Education Program, the Montana Board of Human Resource Managers, the Institute of Certified Management Accountants, the Montana Society of CPAs, the Montana Teacher Professional Renewal Credits, the Montana Board of Social Work Examiners and Professional Counselors, the Society of American Foresters, and the Nursing Home Administrators. We really welcome those of you who are attending for credit. If you have signed up for credit, you should be receiving your certificate in the mail in a couple of weeks. If you just realized that you could be attending for credit and you haven't yet signed up, go out to our front desk and we can handle that for you. As usual in our Montana Economic Outlook seminars, we're going to be examining today the Montana economy, the local economy, and also the major sectors within the Montana economy. We have allowed time for questions after each speaker, so please hold your questions until that time. We would like to begin this morning by focusing on what is perhaps the number one issue here in Montana: how the recession has affected men and women workers in Montana. We're extremely happy to have with us today the chair of the Agricultural Economics Department, or Agricultural Economics and Economics Department at Montana State University, Bozeman. Would you please welcome Wendy Stock.
I always have to lower these microphones. It's unfair. Thank you for coming to today's Economic Outlook seminar. I'm Wendy Stock, and I'm the head of the Ag Econ and Econ department at Montana State. And I get to start us off today. And I'm thinking that the most appropriate start would be for us to have a collective whew, or maybe whew, and hope that the worst of this recession is behind us. Others today are going to talk about their forecasts for specific industries and areas, but I've been asked to speak specifically about the impact of the downturn on men and women and to describe what might lay ahead. In order to look ahead with any clarity, I think we need to take stock of what's been happening to men and women workers in the past year, so that's where I will start. I'd like to focus on 4 particular issues that have gained national and international prominence during the recession because of their male, female, and family relevance. And I'm going to try to compare these evidence on these issues for Montana and for the U.S. more broadly. So first, I'd like to talk about the more negative impacts of the recession on men relative to women. I'd then like to talk about the emerging trend in women becoming closer to a majority of the workforce in the U.S. Thirdly, I'll talk about the recession's impacts on changes in family structure. And then finally, I'll touch on how the recession is impacting changes in educational attainment. So let me start with issue number 1. The more negative impacts of the recession on men have generated a whole new term, mancession. The idea of this term, mancession, is to capture the notion that the recession has hit males particularly hard. So you can see some headlines from the newspapers that I've captured. The great mancession, recession's big layoffs have hit men harder than women. The mancession continues. So headlines have touted this. We've seen some talking heads talking about this stuff. And as an economist, you look back and say, well, is this true? Is there evidence to support this? And indeed, there is pretty strong evidence that men have been hit harder than women during this downturn. So let me start with unemployment rates. If I look at the national unemployment rates here, the blue is for men, and the red is for women. And I have a rough recession bar in that chart. But you can see at the beginning of this recession, or before this recession, the unemployment rates for men and women stood at around 5%. They were the same, okay? Those rates were roughly identical for men and women. And then you see, as the recession moves forward, they start to diverge. And the unemployment rate for men grows much, much faster than the unemployment rate for women. And if you think about the timing, between 2008 and 2009, about 1.7 million more men entered the ranks of the unemployed than did women during that time period. So yes, there is some evidence that, at least on the national level, there is a mancession in terms of unemployment. In Montana, it turns out that it's even more stark. So if I put the Montana figures here, again, a little bit more spread all the way through, but at the beginning of the recession, those unemployment rates, so I'm thinking about 2007, the low here, they're pretty close. They're pretty close to one another. But as the recession goes further, you can see that the difference in the unemployment rate for men and women diverged much more than it did on the national level. And in fact, the unemployment rate for women was somewhat flat during this period. And we'll talk about why that is. So it appears to me that the unemployment rate gaps between men and women do justify that mancession moniker. But before we get worried about this trend isn't really much different from earlier recessions. So it's not something new to this recession. So if I go back in time to the previous 2 recessions, so the early 90s, the early 2000s, and then this one, if I look at male-female unemployment rates in the US, you can see that during these recessionary periods, they do tend to grow apart. They do tend to diverge, and some more than others. And then they tend to converge again during the expansionary period. So the idea that this recession is somehow the mancession, I think, is a little bit misleading, because this tends to happen in recessions overall. If I look at Montana, the gaps are less systematic, and I would argue that this recession has been much more stark in terms of those differences. More evidence on this idea of mancession comes from looking at the proportions of the unemployed for males and females. So let's start with some national figures here. If I look at the share of national unemployment for men and women, you can see that in March 2009, where these data are from, the males made up about 60% of the unemployed in the nation, females 40%. In Montana, it's more stark. So males make up about 74% of the unemployed in Montana, females making up about 25% of the unemployed. So again, this idea of a mancession seems to have some roots in reality, if you will. Given this evidence, we want to think about why. Why is this the case? In Montana in particular, I'd like to look at the industries where men and women tend to work. So the heights of these bars in this chart represent the share of the employment in Montana, and then the color portions represent the proportion of workers in those industries who are males and females. So the services industry is a big chunk of employment in Montana, and that industry has predominantly, although not overwhelmingly, female share of employees. If I look at the mining and energy, for example, it's a relatively small share of jobs in Montana, and it is about 80% a male industry. So if I think about how the economy has changed during this recession, I'm thinking about how the unemployment has changed for men and women. I want to think about how these predominantly male versus female industries have fared during the recession. So let me start with the male industries. That top line is 0. So this is the change in employment between 2008 and 2009. For these industries. So if I look at forestry and fisheries, for example, transportation and utilities, manufacturing, and construction, and those are the industries that had majority male from the last slide, you can see big declines in employment in those industries. And so if we're expecting that the recession has hit men harder than women, then the declines for women-based industries are going to be smaller. That would be our expectation. So let me show you the data on that. It does tend to hold, with the exception of that finance, insurance, and real estate industry, and I think a lot of you in the room understand the downturns in those industries. The industry declines for men have been larger than the industry declines for women. So again, this is more evidence that the recession has hit men more than women. That brings up a second issue. This idea that women are moving to be more of a majority of the workforce. So various headlines again, including this graphic that came out about a week ago in the Economist magazine. You remember the old Rosie the Riveter saying, "We can do it." The caption on this one, "We did it." I'm not sure what the underlying issue is there, but women in the U.S. and some internationally, but particularly in the U.S., are moving to be closer to a majority of the workforce, and there are some issues related to that. I won't really touch on those today, but to think about how the recession has impacted that. So again, another term has been coined, womenomics, to describe some of the changes that one would expect as women move into the majority of the workforce. But here, the trends nationally and in Montana tend to diverge. So let me put some data up here on the national. So the top line here shows the proportion of the workforce that is male, and the red line at the bottom, the proportion that is female. So the 50% line here in the middle would be where we're at 50% male, 50% female. And you can see this long-term kind of trend downward in the proportion of the workforce that's male, and trend upward in the proportion of the workforce that's female. For Montana, again, a little more sporadic, but this recession in particular has come with a divergence rather than a convergence in the proportion of the labor force that's women and men. So you can see that we've had periods where we were at roughly 50-50, but with this recession, we've seen actually a decline in the proportion of the labor force that's female. And the reason that this seems to be taking place is that in Montana, females appear to be leaving the labor force altogether at higher rates than in the nation as a whole. And that takes them out of unemployment statistics. It takes them out of obviously the workforce altogether. And that's different than what we've seen in the nation as a whole. The leavers, the women who are exiting the labor force, appear to be disproportionately from lower income households. And women with young children, which economists expect this in the sense that these are groups that are much more sensitive than others to declines in wage rates. So as the recession has decreased wages or decreased the possibility of working for full time, these groups that are right on the margin between being in and out of the labor force, we see the responses here for women in Montana. So a disproportionate amount of leaving the labor force. This hints a bit at some of the broader changes in family structure that people have paid attention to in recessions. I want to touch on those a bit here. I'm going to skip forward in this slide. There we go. So, thinking in particular impacts on families. So if you Google divorce and recession, you'll get thousands and thousands of hits. Advice, how to save your marriage during a recession. Laments, I got divorced because of the recession. And headlines like this. So divorce during recession, will the market kill your marriage? And issues related to childbearing. And these things generate a lot of internet hype and a lot of break room talk, if you will. But despite the headlines and the hype, the actual impacts of recessions on divorce and marriage are quite small, especially once we factor out other long-term trends that have been happening in divorce and marriage. So let me just hit those a bit. We, again, have relatively small effects of the recession isolated on marriage and divorce. We do tend to see that entry into marriage falls a little during recessions, and that makes sense in the sense that marriages are expensive, and if people are having unstable incomes or worried about where their paycheck's going to come, they might postpone that marriage for a while. The evidence is a little bit more sparse, but it seems to indicate that divorces actually rise during recessions, again, very slightly. The economic theory on this is mixed. On the one hand, you might think divorces are expensive too, so maybe we'll wait it out. But on the other hand, financial stress causes a lot of stress in relationships, and it appears that the latter, that financial stress, is holding more sway. Again, it's very slight change, so I don't want to make too much of this. If we think about childbearing, the recessionary impacts, here the evidence is a little bit more stable and more voluminous. But the recessionary impacts on childbearing are larger than those on marriage and divorce. These cute little buggers are pretty expensive, maybe some of you know, especially over the long haul, and people choose not to have them when their incomes are less stable. So some survey data on this. Delaying pregnancy or limiting the number of children. When you ask women if they're delaying their childbearing or reducing the number of children that they're expecting to have, about 44% say that because of the economy, we do see a reduction in their childbearing or their desires for childbearing and number of children, and it varies according to economic situation. So those who are worse off, maybe they're facing layoff or in more tenuous jobs, they tend to be delaying or reducing their childbearing more, and those from lower income households similarly. So we do see some impacts of recession on childbearing. On a brighter note, headlines have indicated that college enrollment this past year is at record highs. So college enrollment sets a record in 2008, particularly at two-year community colleges and for-profit colleges. Lots of people are heading to college during the recession, and Montana University saw similar trends on this. In terms of numbers, you can see this is college attendance rates for people who have completed high school in the prime college attending years, so ages 18 to 24. So we do see some slight upticks during the recessionary periods, but this is much more a reflection of a long-term trend rather than a big change as a result of the recession. Seeing more college attendance among 18 to 24-year-olds isn't very surprising, but there has been some speculation about older groups. So given the recession's layoffs and job losses, one might expect to see similar increase in attendance among folks over that 25-year-old cutoff, older workers heading back to school to retool or to change careers and the like. But it looks like the data isn't bearing this out, at least not yet. So this is a messy graph. The top portion here, the shaded portion, is telling us the proportion of college students who are age 35 plus. The light blue portion is the proportion of college attenders who are ages 25 to 35, and then the big one is the traditional college age students, age 18 to 24. So if you see that top, that heavy dark blue, hasn't changed much. So those proportions of college students who are ages 35 and above, or even ages 25 to 35, haven't changed much. So we haven't seen the recession causing big changes, big inflows back into college for people above age 25 to retool. But this is from last fall. I think it's something to watch in this regard. In terms of other things to watch, I'm expected to provide a forecast of what's ahead. So like any good economist, I put all of the tools and analysis skills that are at my disposal to make forecasts. And of course, economists are famous for botching their forecasts, right? We've predicted 9 of the last 3 recessions, after all. So anyhow, I turn to my most valuable forecasting tool, the most valuable forecasting tool of any economist, my crystal ball. In terms of issue number 1, the employment rate gap. Like other recessions, I do expect this to narrow, but I think it's going to narrow pretty slowly, probably more slowly in Montana than in the nation as a whole. In terms of bright spots, for men, it looks like public services is an industry that, in an occupational group that hasn't been hit quite as hard as, say, construction, for example, in this recession. In terms of mixed spots, it looks like mining and energy for men, some positive, some negative, and I'm sure that folks coming later that are going to be talking about very specific projections for industries will touch on this more. Longer recovery issues, so these male-dominated industries, construction, forestry and fisheries, transportation and utilities, my expectation is those are going to take a long time to recover, and so that recovery is going to impact men more slowly. For women, bright spots include education and healthcare, and in fact, healthcare during the recession, we didn't see job losses. So this is a very positive thing, but that's an industry that tends to have predominantly female workers. Education similarly. And then some mixed. I talked before about the finance, insurance, and real estate industry, another one that's probably going to take a while to turn around, and that one has a large share of women in it. Trade, services, clerical, and support are all going to depend on growth in other industries, as those are support occupations. So different impacts for men and women in this recovery period. In terms of issue number 2, females becoming a majority of the workforce, in the US, we're practically at that point now. In fact, The Economist magazine that I talked about before puts the percentage women at 49.9 as of October. This doesn't seem to be a reflection of the recession, a blip coming from the recession. This is really more of a long-term trend toward a 50-50 split. In Montana, we've been close to 50-50 for a long time, and this recession appears to be different in terms of those women leaving the labor force. So I think it remains to be seen how far into the recovery before women start entering back into the labor force and moving more toward a 50-50 split there. On the family front, pretty small changes I would expect. So the expansion could lead to small increases in marriage rates, could lead to very small decreases in divorce rates, as I mentioned before, and we would expect to see some small increases in childbearing in terms of the timing and in terms of the number of children that people have. And again, this is going to impact the healthcare sector, predominantly, again, one that's staffed by women. In terms of college enrollments, a slow recovery implies that there's going to be slow movement out of college. So in my own experience, we have a lot more people trying to go to graduate school, maybe because they're interested in graduate school, but maybe because they're trying to wait out, going out and trying to find a job in this economy. So less movement out of higher education, more educational attainment, and then as I noted before, it remains to be seen whether we see an increase in higher educational attainment among non-traditional age college students, those 25 and above. But certainly for 18 to 24-year-olds, I think it's more of the same, increasing amounts of students heading into college. Okay, with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Professor Scott, I'm Representative Diane Sand. One of the issues you didn't address in this, but I think is clearly demonstrated, is the continued job segregation between men and women, and how that relates to the issue that women still continue to make roughly 73 cents for every dollar a man makes in this. And the issue of closing that wage gap has been a priority for many of the women legislators, and certainly lots of groups for lots of years. Could you address the issue related to this information about how the decline in the predominantly male employment sector might begin to even that wage gap out, not because women are making better wages, but because men overall are making less wages, and how the information on people entering the workforce might affect the issue that Montana has one of the highest numbers of people holding 2 or more jobs. Because one of our premises has been, if you could in fact raise the wages of women more toward parity with men, you might see more people spending time with their families, and families not needing to hold 3 or more jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question had 2 parts. One was related to some trends from the recession and more long-term in the male-female wage gap and how the recession might be playing out there. And then the second was related to increases in educational attainment and how those might play a role in decreasing multiple job holding among Montana families. Now, I think I have anticipated this question a bit. There we go. So if I look at Montana versus the U.S., so this is the annual earnings of full-time workers from 2000 until now, adjusted for inflation. So your point is well taken in terms of the gap. So here is the median earnings for males in the U.S. Here is the median earnings level for males in Montana, females in the U.S., and females in Montana. So the question is particularly aimed at the gap, right? The distance between those two, which, rough look here in Montana, you're talking about $10,000 per year. And that's not too far away from what the gap is nationally, but it's certainly there. And if I think about why that is, again, these are those gender mixes in the industry. So if I look in Montana at the earnings of males and females within industries, they are a little closer. You don't see those $10,000 gaps. But, most of those lines, the male bar is higher. The forestry and fisheries one I worry about a little bit, and that's one of the reasons I have this slide in the appendix. Is a very small number of observations here, so don't take this to the bank. First Interstate won't be happy about that. So you do see these gaps, and so in construction, for example, and in manufacturing, as those industries have seen decreases in employment, it's true that we would expect to see this earnings gap start to close. And again, not because women's earnings are rising so much, but because men's earnings are falling. And I think that's not a good way to reach parity, if you will. So one way to get at that is, I think, education, and you touched on that very well. So I have one slide here that can talk a little bit about that. The evidence is there that college-educated workers earn more, and so we would expect that if we have a higher college attendance rates, for example, we would expect to see earnings rising as a result of that. And so what we see, we have national trends, and I have MSU trends here. So in the U.S., the proportion of Notice the red line is above. So the proportion of college students in the U.S. is 54% female and 46% male in the U.S. Okay, so majority of college students in the U.S. are females, not males. In Montana, notice that's flipped. So I have the proportion of college students at MSU, at least, is roughly 54% male, and the proportion of college students that are female at MSU is about 46 or so percent female. So if this were going up, we would expect to see those educational attainments start to close the gap for the right reasons, right? Because we have higher earnings for women as they're entering more skilled jobs or whatever the case may be. But I don't see, at least in this recession, at least at MSU, maybe the data for Missoula are different at some of the other universities, but the college attendance rates for females versus males are flipped from the US. So I don't see this as particularly hopeful evidence on that front, unfortunately. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Other questions?
Just a clarification, you've got it listed as MSU. Is that just Bozeman or should it be
Just Bozeman.
MUS?
MUS, I don't have that data out. Yes, I'm sorry about that.
So this is representative of just the Bozeman school?
Just the Bozeman. So the question was, is this representative of MSU and all the satellite campuses, or is this representative of the university system, MUS? And the answer is it's Bozeman only. It's because it's close to my heart.
Other questions? Questions? None? So thank you very much, Wendy. I'd like to point out that for the first time in 33 years, Chuck Keegan is not with us. He just got out of the hospital. But don't worry, it wasn't anything serious. He had the rotator cuff repaired on his fishing arm. Now, your briefing book contains a number of key elements that the speakers are going to be referring to. It also contains additional data that you might find useful. The speakers' PowerPoints are going to be available on our website in a couple of weeks. Now we'd like to look specifically at the global, the national, and the local economies. And I'd like to introduce the Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Pat Barkey.
Well, good morning. Wendy talked about stress and recessions, and I sense there's a little bit of stress in this room over economic outlook presentations. And I hope to relieve you of that stress. It's certainly been a tough year for the Montana economy, but we believe that the worst is solidly behind us. As we stand here today, we already have solid evidence that the U.S. economy has turned the corner and has been growing since late summer. We believe this is also true for Montana, although we don't have the data to prove it, and we won't have the data to prove it for several months. So I'll be describing this morning what that economic recovery will look like. As we'll see, it's going to be a little different. And that's because this recession has been different in several ways from anything we've seen in the past. It's been a recession which has been longer, it's been more severe, it's also been more global than any recession in recent memory. It's a recession that wiped out our wealth. It's a recession that took our retirement counts down. It took our home values away. It took our stock market wealth away and had an enormous impact on household spending as a result. It's a recession that precipitated the worst crisis of confidence we've seen on Wall Street and other financial areas since the 1930s, something that came close to a complete meltdown in terms of the confidence with which financial institutions did routine transactions with one another, stood the world on its head, and was very damaging to the economy. It's also been a recession which has generated what I consider an unprecedented, coordinated policy response around the world, from large economies and small, who have operated in concert to stimulate their economies and try to bring the worst of the recession to an end. And of course, that was very evident here in the United States. Get an idea of the difference of this recession. If you look at 9 recessions which have occurred since World War II, and you put them on a graph, where what we do with this graph is we try to look at, on the horizontal axis, how deep the recession was, how severe it was. And on the vertical axis, the bounce back, the strength of the recovery. So here's 9 recessions that are already in the books. And it begins all the way back to 1948 and goes right up to 2001, where we have this kind of data. And if you look at this, you notice that there's a relationship here, a positive relationship, which suggests usually that when you have a deep recession, you have a vigorous recovery, and vice versa, shallow recession, weak recovery. Here's where we stand with respect to the current recession. We're off the grid here. We clearly don't know what kind of recovery we're going to have yet, but we do know it's been a very severe recession, so we're far off to the right. There's 3 dots there which refer to the forecasts made by blue chip forecasters, a consensus of economists, if you can believe such a thing. And you see that there's 3 there, but the middle dot, all 3 dots are calling for a weak recovery in 2010. And it's off the line. It's been a severe recession, but a weak recovery is forecasted. That's different. What else is different about this recession? Well, one thing's true of this recession has been true of every recession, and that is the economy goes in reverse. And there's a pattern of all these post-war recessions where the economy starts to shrink, and then the economy comes into recovery and it starts to grow again. Again, there's been a lot of recessions since World War II when economists started really tracking these things, and they all have that pattern. As a matter of fact, if I put them all up here, I get this blizzard of lines here, which refers to the fact that not all recessions are the same. Some are more severe, some are less severe, some have stronger recoveries, some have weaker recoveries. Where's this recession? Well, this recession is at the bottom, okay? This recession, as you can see, it started out shallow. By the way, this is the decline in the economy as we move from recession beginning towards to where we are now. We're now 8 quarters out. That line has started to come up a little bit. As I mentioned, the U.S. economy has been growing. But you can see that 8 quarters out, the economy has now suffered a greater contraction than any recession since World War II. That's the bad news. The good news is it's still on the chart. It's still on the same page. It's really pretty close to some other recessions we've suffered. But of course, that's clearly not where we want to be. But that gives you a little perspective. Another thing that's different about this recession is how global the recession has been. It's been a recession where the industrialized economy and the developing economies all went into the recession practically at the same time. Now, this is a graph. I think I've outdone Paul Polzin here. He always puts these long graphs. I've got a century on this graph, okay? Let's see what he's got. Okay, this is 100 years of looking at all the economies around the world and trying to keep track of how many of them are in recession in any given year. And there are peaks and there are valleys here. It's interesting, and it's kind of hard to see on this graph, but just before we went into this recession, practically no economies were in recession, all right? But at the very end of this graph, you see a spike. And that, of course, is what's been happening right now. And it's been the highest proportion of countries in recession at the same time since the Great Depression. All right. Again, there's others that have been close, but it certainly points out that this is a different aspect. This is not like the 2001 recession or like the 1991 recession. It's a little bit more like the oil shocks, and it's been a significant event globally. One of the things which is really going to impact the recovery has been what has happened to household wealth as a result of this recession. And before this recession, it was good news. When we got our quarterly statements from our brokers, we ran to the mailbox to open the envelope. Okay? We're doing that a little bit now again, I'll grant you, but there was a while there when we just put them aside. And of course, this was a story up to 2007, was a considerable appreciation of all of our assets, primarily our homes, which is the biggest share of household wealth, but also our financial wealth. It grew very strongly, but in a short span of time, beginning with 2008 and of course troughing in the beginning of 2009, $17 trillion of our wealth went away, which caused an enormous change in our buying habits. In the last quarter of 2008, consumer spending fell at an annualized rate of 30%. All right, try to be a retailer in those situations. Clearly, that's a challenge. There's been some recovery since then, but you can see there's a long ways to go. And in fact, as those retirement accounts lost value, as our fund money went away, so to speak, as we were no longer able to tap into rising home equity to fund consumption, all those things are putting the brakes on spending. And that's a very important reason why this recovery is so different. Well, what has been done to attack these problems? Of course, we look to the federal government to really take reins in terms of control of the economy. And of course, there's two main arrows in the quiver there. One is fiscal policy, which is working with taxes and spending, either to return extra money to consumers in the hope that they'll spend it, or spending money directly by government. The second big thrust, of course, is something we broadly call monetary policy, which is manipulating interest rates and growth in the money supply. These are the kinds of things that have been done traditionally, and these have been pursued very aggressively. In fact, if we look at how aggressively these have been carried out, we need a historical perspective. And in this perspective, what we're actually going to do is not compare this recession to the last few recessions, because this recession has been different. I want to compare this recession to some of the great financial panics of our lifetimes and possibly our parents' lifetimes. I'm going to look at what's happened in the U.S. versus what happened in Japan in the late 80s and early 90s. I also want to look at what's happened in respect to the Great Depression in the 30s. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the speed of policy response. And I'm going to use as the starting point the beginning of the decline in the stock market. So it's a little bit different from the usual recession graph. But there's really some heartening news here. Let's first look at monetary policy. What this graph tries to show is the months that elapsed before policies took effect. So in this case, monetary policy, interest rates. How long did it take the central bank to drop interest rates as low as they could drop them? Which of course is the short-term rates, not unfortunately the rates we pay, but the short-term rates typically charged by the Federal Reserve to member banks. And here you see that in the United States, in this experience, which is the bottom bar, it only took 6 months. 6 months after the decline in the stock market, the Federal Reserve had taken interest rates practically to zero. In Japan, it took 6 years for that to happen, all right? During the Great Depression, it took about 2.5 years. Europe and the UK also reasonably fast. Fiscal policy. How long did it take for the government to pass a stimulus fiscal package? In this case, this would be the first stimulus, which was passed when George Bush was still president. Again, it only took 6 months, all right? Europe and the UK were also fairly fast. You can see some of these other events in the past. You may not know the Japanese downturn, but believe me, it's been a very serious one. And we've all heard of the Great Depression. Again, very quick policy response. And I think we have to think about that when we think about where the economy is going, because that's been a very good thing. Finally, there's financial stabilization. This has been somewhat controversial, to put it mildly. Bankers are in the crosshairs in many policy circles because they've been bailed out. Obviously, yes, they've been bailed out. But we as economists would argue this is a good thing. And in fact, it happened relatively quickly, and it really brought the financial panic to a halt. And this is very good for Montana. Again, you see in the U.S., it took 13 months. Within 13 months of the declines in the stock market, which go all the way back to August of 2007, the Federal Reserve was already doing things like buying mortgage-backed security, buying corporate debt, injecting capital into the system to try to regularize, to try to invoke some stability and give some liquidity to the folks who were really hurting, and the folks that didn't have cash that simply couldn't function. Again, Japan, I can't read that from here, but It was a long time, 5 years, whatever it was. So this has been good. Okay, what about Montana? Well, it's been a recession like no other in Montana. It's brought the first 2 consecutive year decline in income we've seen in the state since the late 1980s. It's been a recession which has broadened and deepened since the last time we were talking here in the Hilton Garden. Every sector of the economy, every part of the state has been impacted by this recession. It's brought about quite a bit of job decline. We think those job declines peaked roughly 1 year from now, in the first quarter of 2009. But when I say declines peaked, it doesn't mean we're still not seeing job declines. It's just that they've worn off slightly. It's brought about, and it's going to keep bringing about, a serious hangover in state government, primarily because the instruments that state government uses to raise revenue are based primarily on income, and that tax base is going to lag behind recovery in the rest of the economy. Let's look at a couple of key sectors. Housing. This probably is why economic outlook events bring on stress. Sorry. This is not a pretty picture. Housing has seen, from its pre-recession peak, which would be roughly about 2006, housing's seen at least a 70% decline in building construction, residential building construction. This is a case in which the Montana economy suffered a contraction every bit as bad as what happened in the national economy. Perhaps not as bad as some of the states that are even lower than the national average, but certainly we're average here. And the big story here, of course, is what's the recovery look like? It's going to be weak. There's a lot of adjustments. Scott Rickard's going to talk about that coming up. A lot of adjustments still ahead in housing. And we're not bullish about housing. We think the negatives have stopped, but it's certainly not going to be robust growth coming out. One of the other things which I think contradicts some of the prevailing wisdom and some of the talking heads that have been mentioning things about the Montana economy lately is, contrary to what you may have heard, the U.S. and Montana are moving together in this recession much more than people think. Let's look at the pattern of job decline in the national economy. This is quarterly. So the first 4 bars are 2008. That lowest bar is the first quarter of 2009. And of course, that's the remaining quarters of last year. And it's a pattern exactly like I described earlier. The declines peaked in the U.S. economy in the first quarter. We'd like to see those turn into job gains, but at least you can see the negatives are getting smaller. Here's the Montana pattern of job declines. It's not exactly the same. There's some mixed performance in 2008, but there's the same general pattern, in that the largest decline came in the first quarter of 2009. In fact, as you can see clearly from this graph in percentage terms, that decline was more severe than what happened in the national economy. How did that play out across the economy? Well, we track job gains and job losses by major industry. It's kind of a long list here, but there's animation in this which will help us try to understand. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up some growth bars that are going to indicate growth or decline in employment in different industries, and I think this goes back to 2006. So here's natural resources and agriculture. You can see, if you can have your glasses on, some declines as you get into 2009. Here's construction. Sadly, this one shows up more vividly. We know construction has really taken it on the chin. Here you can see quarterly how that's played out, with some declines getting even larger as we move into 2009. Manufacturing, which includes wood products, sadly in the negative in most of these bars. Here's an important one that's been a big surprise. Trade, transportation, and utilities includes retail trade. Look at those job declines, especially in the first quarter of 2009. Information is a small industry. Finance is not too big. Professional and business services. White-collar profession, many people think recession-proof. Not so. Many of these jobs are tied up very intimately with serving the production side of the economy here in Montana, and there have been declines and there's been gains in earlier in the recession. Education and healthcare, mostly positive. That's been a sector which has largely been immune to the recession. Leisure and hospitality, near an enormous heart, has been challenged. Other services, and finally government, which has typically been positive. This is another one of these stressful graphs, because if you look at the pattern of job decline, of course, this is something that shows up again spiking in the first quarter of 2009. The story here is how the recession has broadened. As we've gone further and further along in the history on this graph, it's gotten into more and more industries. Very few ports in the storm here. Let's take a look at geographically how this recession has descended on us. This is a way trying to depict what's happened to wage growth. So these are wages and salaries paid to workers in all the counties west of the Mississippi. And what you need to know to understand this graph is that red is fast. Red is fast growth, blue is second fastest, gray is slowest growth. So here let's start in 2006 when the economy was running very hot. You can see the hot spots in the economy, at least west of the Mississippi here, Arizona, Las Vegas, Wyoming, Texas, etc., and a lot of red in Montana as well, and Idaho. As we go into 07, that's when the housing bubble starts to burst in California. California is no longer red. Oregon's gone out. Idaho has kind of gone down. But some of the areas remain doing pretty well. As we go into 08, this gets more and more gray. You see a real slowdown happening in the housing bubble areas in Nevada, Arizona, California. You see patches of red remaining in the energy-dependent parts of the economies, western North Dakota, Wyoming, and the oil patch in Texas, still running pretty strong. What's happening in Montana over this period? Well, again, we can look at Montana, and Montana in 06 was a good story, especially western Montana. Plenty of red, plenty of blue. That's real prosperity in all the areas you can see. As we go forward in time, 2007, not too much different. The big change comes in 2008. 2008 was a big change. We see a lot of gray. We see a lot of counties, especially in western Montana, the formerly fast-growing Flathead, Gallatin, etc., even Missoula, Yellowstone County. All the big counties here are in gray with the exception of Lewis and Clark. Just a couple reds left. Now in 2009, we can put together the data we have plus our forecast, and this is what we look like in 2009. Okay, every single county except Stillwater is in the lowest growth category. A lot of these are negatives. This is something which has astounded us in our office because we don't find any ports in the storm. We don't find any counties that are escaping this recession almost as you move across the entire state. Well, let's take a look, let's think about the forecast because this is a story of recovery, and as we move into recovery, there are things which are helping the Montana economy stay above water and to thrive, and there are things that we're fighting against. So there's headwinds and tailwinds. Let's look at what's behind us first. There has been, and there continues to be, and I'll show it in a moment, a pretty impressive rebound in prices for commodities and energy goods. And this may not make you happy when you fill your gas pump, but it makes the state treasury feel pretty good. As a matter of fact, some of the energy-related taxes are one of the things that are keeping the general fund in Helena afloat. But there's been a pretty impressive rebound. Some question is how strong that rebound will be next year, but that's been good for the Montana economy. Asian economies are picking up. The non-Japan part of Asia is growing pretty fast, and of course they're big consumers, as Paul has indicated in past seminars, big consumers of many of the commodities that we produce here in Montana. Another piece of good news is in housing. The housing bubble has not been as bad here in Montana as it has been in other parts of the country. And what I mean by that, it's been a tough year for real estate, tough year for construction, no question about it. What I'm talking about is how that has impacted the rest of the economy. We don't have the same kind of overhangs in housing that we see in some of the real bubble areas like Arizona, inland California, and so forth. Foreclosures are rising, but they're lower than they are in many other parts of the country. We also have some industries which are important in the Montana outlook, which have been sources of stability, at least relatively speaking. George Haynes will talk about agriculture, where the news is not all good, but relatively speaking, it's not bad. It's been something which has helped keep the rural counties in Montana doing much better. And of course, the presence of the federal government in the Montana economy, as Paul Polzin has pointed out in numerous presentations here in the past, remains a stabilizing force in many economies, including Missoula, as you go around the state. Against us is the permanent closures in wood products. Todd Morgan will talk about what's happening in wood products industry, but most of us know that many of the facilities which have been closed recently are not coming back. That's something the economy has to work to overcome. We see no sign of a quick return in construction. So a quick adrenaline boost by throwing up lots of neighborhoods in the next year is not going to happen. And finally, there's still a lot of reticence on the part of consumers to spend money. This is nationally and in Montana. It's been a tough year for retail here in Missoula. It's certainly the fuel for the fire to have retail pick up speed quickly. It doesn't look like it's going to be there in 2010, and this is something we have to work to overcome. Commodity prices have rebounded. If you look at what's happened to commodities, and commodities important to Montana, you look at what's happened to prices. This is a 5-year graph, so this is about 4 years worth of commodity price information. It's been a roller coaster. Copper, lead, oil, and zinc have not exactly been in sync, but all generally have the pattern of rising very quickly until we got into the recession, and then they fell like a rock. And the trough of this graph right here as I stop is about where we were in February of last year. Look what's happened since that point. Every one of these commodities has risen. In fact, some of them are up to their levels of early 2007. Oil, lead, copper, and zinc. Of course, this is constantly changing the equation for investment in Montana's natural resource industries. And I would argue, unless you happen to be a buyer of these goods, from the point of view of Montana, it's been a good thing. Well, where do we see things in Montana? Well, what we do is we try to track non-farm labor income, which is the closest measure we can find to the output of the Montana economy, corrected for inflation. We look at the growth of this. And we see 2007, which is already in the books, but these numbers are always being revised, came in about 2% growth. 2008 is when we started to turn negative. 2008, we saw a 0.7 negative growth, and of course that growth got worse, as I said, in 2009. That's when the trough was for the recession here in Montana. So there you see 2 years consecutive of declines in income. Where do we see things in 2010? Well, we're calling for growth in 2010. The U.S. economy is growing. We think the Montana's economy is growing, but that growth is not going to be very rapid. About 1.3% growth in 2010. This is for the state economy. Paul will talk about Missoula. That's not enough growth, unfortunately, to spark real job increases. It is enough growth to halt job declines. So we are not seeing much room for any job increases in 2010 in the Montana economy. What that also means is there's probably going to be not much movement in the unemployment rate either. In 2010, 2012, and 2013, we're more optimistic as we see some of these overhangs being worked up that we can bring ourselves back to levels of growth which I think will bring us job growth and a little bit more comfort. Look at this another different way. If you look at the performance of the state economy going all the way back to the end of the last recession, so starting in 2002 and stopping in 2007, this is the quarterly growth in the Montana economy. It's a little noisier. It goes up and down, strong quarters, weak quarters, but averaged about 3.3%. So that gives you a little benchmark now to compare these forecasts against. If you look during the recession period, of course, we had those 2 consecutive years of decline, averaged about 1.2% over the 2-year period. But now here's the big story is where is the recovery? And the recovery is about 2.4%, again, going out over our whole horizon, which takes us out through 2013. Slower recovery, particularly as you can see those growth bars coming right out of the recession 2010, aren't even going to be up to 2.4%. So a slower recovery, it is a recovery. It's going to require some adjustments. It's not going to feel like a recovery until we really get that big swing in job growth, which we don't think is going to happen until about 2011. So with that, I'm going to stop, and what we're going to do is we're going to go right into Paul's presentation on Missoula, and then we'll both be up here to take questions. Thank you very much.
Now, as Pat pointed out, there's almost no part of the state that escaped the impact of this recession. But the recession impacts do vary from one city to another within Montana. And I'd like to look specifically at Missoula and see how the recession is playing out here in the Missoula metropolitan area. Now, the Missoula data is presented on page 8 in your briefing book. Now, before we look at the recession, let's look at the long run. What has been going on in the Montana economy and the various city economies since 2001? And since 2001, the period 2001 to 2007, basically represents the recovery phase from the last business cycle, the recovery phase from the 2001 recession. Statewide, from 2001 to 2007, we had average growth of about 3.2% per year. That's relatively rapid by historic standards, because remember, Montana was experiencing the benefits of the commodity and the energy boom. 2004, 5, and 6 were some of the fastest growth in the Montana economy since the 1970s. Now let's look at how this played out across the cities. Here we have average city growth between 2001 and 2007. I think one of the most surprising features of this graph, especially here in Missoula, is the relatively slow growth for Missoula and Ravalli County. And later on, we'll see that the recession was particularly strong here in Missoula. What may be surprising is that the slow growth in the Missoula economy is not something recent. It's been occurring now ever since the beginning of this recovery, since 2001. And not only is Missoula a relatively slow-growing economy right now, it is now growing slower than it did during the 1990s. Now, the reason why Missoula is lagging behind the other parts of the state right now is because the energy and the commodity boom is primarily concentrated in the eastern part of the state. At the same time, Missoula has been losing some of its benefits as a retail trade center here in western Montana. So those are the two reasons why Missoula is lagging behind the rest of the state. The rest of the state is growing faster, and we're losing some of our dominance in terms of retail trade. Now, if you look at the other cities, you can see that the Montana cities can be divided into three rough groups. The slower growing cities are Missoula and Great Falls. You can see that Butte, Yellowstone County, and Lewis and Clark County, that's Billings and Helena, are growing right about the statewide average. And the fastest growing part of the state, at least during this period, was the Flathead and Gallatin County economies. And as we'll see in just a minute, they were that fast growth in Flathead and Gallatin County was primarily due to a housing bubble. It's real estate and construction in those areas. Now let's take a look at the recession. Let's take a look specifically here in Missoula and look at the pattern of the recession here in Missoula. And what we're looking at here is percent change in total employment. And it's monthly data, and we use monthly data because that gives us a little more precise way of looking at the trends. You can see the recession officially began in December 2007. You can see that Missoula actually started to turn down before the recession began. That was that first closure out at Bonner. During 2008, you can see that we kind of held our own at about zero growth. And then beginning in the first part of, or last part of 2008 and the first part of 2009, you can see that sharp downward deceleration in employment growth. Now, if you've been reading the paper, you saw that a couple of days ago there was a wire story about Missoula declining 4.7% during the third quarter of 2009. And then in the paper this morning, you see that when you actually look at the revised data, that Missoula was declining about 2.7% during the third quarter. This data ends with the second quarter of 2009, but notice that that's right about where we were in May, June, July of 2007, between a 2 and 3% decline. So I would say the current data suggests, or the latest data suggests, that we are bouncing along down there at somewhere between a 2 and 3% annual decline. Just for comparison, let's look at another place. Here's Billings. You can see that Billings started to turn downward too right after the onset of the recession. The Billings economy decelerated through 2008 and then experienced declines in late 2008 and early 2009. Both Missoula and Billings were experiencing roughly the same declines during 2009. Let's look at the other cities and how has Missoula fared compared to the other cities. Here we have the employment declines, or the employment figures, from March 2008 to March 2009. And whenever you use monthly data, you really have to be careful that you compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. March 2008 to March 2009 is not quite the peak to trough of this recession, but it's pretty close. You can see as we look across Montana cities, again, we can kind of divide them into three groups. The two cities that have experienced the least recession impact are Helena and Great Falls. That's Lewis and Clark County and Cascade County. Missoula and Billings, Missoula and Yellowstone County are in between, and you can see what happened in Gallatin and Flathead. They were the fastest growing counties, and they are experiencing the greatest decline. That's simply because of one of the reasons is the concentration of construction and real estate in those economies. Now, like Pat said, this recession is hitting all parts of the economy and all parts of the state. Let's quickly look at how this plays out in the various cities. Construction, as Pat said, was one of the sectors that statewide is being impacted very strongly. Here we have the change in construction employment during the 2-year period, June 2007 to June 2009. So you can see very quickly that the big declines were over there in Flathead and Gallatin County, almost 40% decline. Notice the same thing is true for Ravalli County. Even though the bubble was not as great in Ravalli County as it was in Flathead and Gallatin County, that decline in construction employment is still sizable. You can see that like even in Cascade County and Lewis and Clark County, which had the least overall recession impact, there still was sizable decline in construction. The other industry that was really widely hit was retail trade. Here we have the change in retail trade employment between March 2008 and March 2009. Once again, the big impact, Flathead and Gallatin County. But even counties like Lewis and Clark and Cascade County had 5 to 6% declines in retail trade. And again, Missoula and Yellowstone are somewhat in between there. So even in those areas like Lewis and Clark and Cascade County, which had relatively small overall impacts, there were still big impacts in terms of construction and retail trade. Okay, now let's turn to the outlook here in Missoula. What are the movers and shakers in the Missoula economy? Here is a picture of Montana or Missoula County's economic base. You can see the largest single component now is University of Montana and other state government. Those two sectors that are called trade center represent the people who come to Missoula to shop, see a doctor or dentist, or do other business. This does not include all of healthcare. This does not include all of retail trade. This simply includes that portion of healthcare and that portion of retail trade that's attributable to non-residents coming to Missoula. And you can see that they too together account for a sizable share of Missoula's economic base. The federal government, that includes the Forest Service, the wood and paper products industry, that 12% figure is probably a little high given what the closure of Smurfit Stone. This is based on past data. Transportation includes both railroad and trucking, non-resident travel, and other. So what are we looking for in terms of the outlook for each of these basic industries? As Pat said, we see no major recovery in construction during 2010. That's probably not going to occur until 2011 or even later. The state government is now experiencing a pay freeze. This applies both to the University of Montana and other state government workers. So we're not going to be getting much of a stimulus from state government. But remember, if we look at past cases, when the pay freeze expires in 2011 and 2012, there's often a small retroactive pay increase. So there might be a little bump up once that pay freeze expires. Nothing is doing well in western Montana right now, so we don't look for a lot of stimulus coming in terms of people coming to Missoula to shop. I'm just very reticent to make any forecast about the medical industry given what's going on at the national level right now, but healthcare is unlikely to be a negative component. It's about to stay stable or maybe slight growth. Federal government, there might be some slight stimulus coming from there, depending on how the stimulus bill plays out and what projects appear and how they show up in 2010. There's not much good news in the wood products industry, and we're looking for the transportation and non-resident travel to be stable or maybe slightly growing as the U.S. economy recovers. Those two industries are often very tied to U.S. trends. So how is that going to play out in terms of our forecast? Here's where we were during 2007, 8, and 9. We basically had no growth during the last 2 years, 2008 and 2009. Here is our forecast going forward. When we ran this early part of December, we were looking at about a 0.7% decline for 2010. I think we were overly optimistic. I wouldn't be surprised now to see 2 to 3% decline during 2010. Now that represents 3 straight declines for the Missoula economy. We have not experienced that since the mid-1980s. Then we're looking for recovery to start beginning in 2011 and 12. That 2012 figure is probably buoyed a little bit by the end of the state government pay freeze, but we're looking for the recovery to start in 2011 and gradually gain speed. But even so, our average growth in 2011, 12, 13, and 14 is probably going to be less than was experienced during the last 5 years before the recession. So with that, I'd like to have Pat come up, and maybe we can answer some of your questions. Questions? Not a very optimistic outlook for Missoula.
What percentage of labor income is stone container compared to overall Missoula County labor income?
Smurfit Stone, what? That represents what, 10% of the economic, or what was it? No, I can't remember. You're talking about what percent of the economic base was accounted for by Smurfit Stone? Labor income. Of total labor income? Give me your card and I'll call you later on. We did that calculation a couple of weeks ago.
It is on my desk.
Yeah. The number just,
It was double digits in terms of the economic base.
that's roughly true, but we can get that for you. Other questions? Yes?
What prediction do you make about population change during the next year, given the economy?
The question is, what do we think is going to happen to population change, given what's happened to the economy? I just saw a report from the Census Bureau that said that overall, nationwide, migration of all times has declined dramatically. So if that's true here in Missoula, we're probably going to be looking at stable population or a much, much slower growing population, at least during 2010 and 2011.
Do you think it will actually decline like it did when some of the major mills closed in the past?
Do we think that the population will actually decline as occurred during the mid-'80s when we had the past closures? I think that's possible. Because Missoula's population growth has really decelerated in the last 4 or 5 years. So I wouldn't be surprised to see stability or even a slight decline.
Oh, yeah, that Remy. Right.
What did that show?
Yeah, we've done some analysis of the closure, and of course, unsurprisingly, it does indicate that one event does have a significant negative impact on population. So that's all I can add to it.
Other questions?
Anybody want to scratch their head?
Has the Bureau done any hypothetical forecasting of what would happen if, whether it's federal stimulus or something came in and allowed the wood forest industry, wood products industry to clean up, harvest the timberland around western Montana?
Have we done any analysis in terms of, economic impact of alternative developments in the wood products industry? It's probably best left for Todd Morgan, who really will have a lot to say about that later on in the program. We have looked at that.
Pat Barkey, in your presentation, you described 70% of the world economy as being impacted simultaneously. What are the 30% that are not? And are there any characteristics?
Okay, what are the 30%? What are the 30% of the countries that are not impacted by the recession? They all tend to be small. That graph is a little misleading. It doesn't count dollars, it counts countries. And that's why I had to make it a percent of countries, because the number of countries has changed. The countries not impacted by the recession, not in recession, well, the biggest one is China, okay? And although the Pacific Rim countries were impacted significantly, Singapore and Taiwan, some of the other countries did suffer a recession. It's typically the countries that are not as integrated into the world economy. And again, we count countries. So you count countries in Africa, you count countries in South America. Latin America has done reasonably well in this recession as well. It's hard to characterize that 30%. But the biggest one is China. Brazil has done fairly well. Latin America has done surprisingly well. That's about as much as I can say. It's a pretty diverse group.
What analysis do you do of income distribution and the changes in non-farm income across the deciles of the income distribution? In other words, are all levels of income experiencing similar changes in income? Or are we seeing it concentrated in certain portions of the income distribution? And that would be nationally and locally in the data available.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the greatest things about that question is you said it so loud I think everybody can hear it. Which unfortunately takes away my ability to rephrase that question into something I can answer. So I'm really on the spot. In Montana, we don't know much about income distribution yet. We typically really get good data every 10 years. So nationally, the impact of the recession, it may surprise you to know that the recession has had an evening of the income distribution. It's been the high wealth, the high rollers that have taken the biggest hit. That's one reason, by the way, that state government is hurting, because a lot of the income that's collected as part of the income tax here in Montana, but federally as well, comes from the higher income folks. You may have heard that federal revenues, federal government seems to worry about revenues, they just spend anyway, but federal revenues are down about 20%. So again, I think for those who want a flatter income distribution, you've gotten your wish. But I'm not sure if we did that the way that we want to do it. Sort of similar to what Wendy said about male-female earnings differentials and so forth. But it's been a recession that's impacted the higher end more than the lower end.
On your commodity pricing and projections, are you taking into account of the reduction of our production on the oil fields, especially? Granted, we have an increase in the commodity price. We also have a reduction in the flow currently. In your long-range projections, are you anticipating a growth of drilling so our production moves back up, or are you kept it in the reduction trend that we're in right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's the prediction for production, particularly oil? I would think we're thinking about right there. what's the forecast for production? Because many of us have heard of pretty drastic declines in oil production, particularly here in Montana, but across the country. Well, I think you're hinting at the answer there, which I think is accurate. What we did is we took a look at commodity prices, which clearly factors into revenues as well. I think it's consistent with higher commodity prices that production will come around as well. All right, but we did not specifically forecast Montana oil production.
Want to talk about Bakken?
No, go ahead.
Well, of course, the big thing in oil production is the Bakken field. That's that field that straddles North Dakota, Saskatchewan, and Montana. Most of that is in North Dakota and Saskatchewan. That's why Sydney right now is doing so well. They're part of that. And I think one of the issues always has to be whether these rigs go on the North Dakota side or whether they go on the Bakken side. And I'll let somebody else argue that, but that one of the major issues has to do with taxes that are part of the Montana system versus a part of it that is in North Dakota. But everything we hear about the Bakken field, this thing keeps getting bigger. So I think if there's a question about where's the production going to come from, the production is, the Bakken field is the place that looks most promising.
What impact do you think the spike in gold and silver prices will have on mining in Montana? And how long is it between when they start thinking about doing something and when it actually happens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's on a roll.
Oh yeah. The question is, with higher prices, how long will it be until production occurs? And gold, but other things too. And this brings up a very, very important public policy issue, and that has to do with the permitting of these mines. These mines don't just all of a sudden show up. They have to go through a lengthy permitting process that I think some people think is perhaps too lengthy and too onerous. We're only simply looking at the preconditions. The preconditions are higher prices, and that is going to make more people look at the possibility of increased production. I think this is something that you all, as legislators, need to keep in mind is what role now does public regulation take into that whole process? So that's my response. It depends on the regulation process now. The preconditions appear to be there. Higher prices are there. How this plays out, I think, is something we do have some control over.
Yeah, the question's about commercial real estate, and this is really something that I'll just say right offhand. I mean, we're up here at this podium talking about the economy. We hear mostly about commercial real estate from the folks we talk in the lobby and so forth. There's a lot of concern over commercial real estate. There's a lot of concern over as property is rolled over, what's happened to the value of that real estate, how much money are lenders willing to lend when those loans turn over. We've heard a lot of things that worry us about commercial real estate, and I think that's here in Missoula as elsewhere across the state. The issue is really largely the same as what happened in residential real estate, namely you're looking at property that has lost its value, lost some of its value, and how is that going to play out in terms of the loans and the turnover loans. All I can say is that we're concerned about it. We don't have a lot of hard data on it. We've heard a lot of stories about what has happened. It's also a concern because a lot of smaller and community banks are exposed to that. So we've certainly heard a lot about the tightening of credit. And if I had time, and talked about the risks to the economic recovery. That's a big one in terms of what's going to happen with commercial real estate. Is there any possibility that what happened in residential real estate could play out again in commercial real estate? So far it hasn't, but we're worried about it.
One more question. I know you're having caffeine problems. Yes.
You just mentioned that you kind of revised the Missoula outlook as -2 to 3% for 2010. Do you think that's going to spread to other counties in western Montana also?
The question is whether the gloomier outlook for Missoula will spread to the other counties in western Montana. Probably not. Well, as far as Ravalli County, yes, because Missoula and Ravalli County are very independent or dependent. But Mineral, Sanders, Granite, those counties probably not, because there's not much interplay between what goes on in Missoula and what happens in Granite County. Most of it goes the other way. What happens in Granite County has an impact on Missoula County. So with that, I'd like to declare a coffee break. Thank you.